The 2024 NFL schedule is half treasure map, half red herring. If you know how to leverage it correctly, you can draft teams with $1,000,000 upside. If you let it mislead you, it can cost you thousands of dollars in entry fees. In this video, I'm going to outline how to properly leverage the NFL schedule in your best ball drafts throughout the summer, avoid one big mistake that too many drafters make, identify the 3 teams with the best playoff schedules, and dive into what the data actually says about bye weeks. I'm Pete Overzet. This is the Deposit Kingdom. Let's unpack this NFL schedule. The NFL schedule is a critical piece of the puzzle when it comes to drafting best ball teams in tournaments like Best Ball Mania 5. There are 2 main reasons why it's so important. 1, we now know who is playing in the most important weeks of the season, weeks 16 and 17, which allows us to set up game stacks on our rosters. And 2, we now know the bye weeks and can do our best to avoid taking a 0 at the QB or tight end position in a given week. We've already spent plenty of time on this channel discussing why stacking and game stacking is so important. There's literally millions of dollars worth of examples, and if you haven't watched our recent week 16 versus 17 video, then I recommend pausing this, watching that first, and then coming back to finish this video. What we are going to cover in this video is how to actually go about game stacking in these Underdog best ball tournaments, including whether we should ever be reaching ahead of ADP for correlation. The biggest trap that drafters can fall into once they've seen the light on the importance of game stacking in the playoff weeks is thinking they can predict which games are going to pop off and which ones are going to flop. Playing this guessing game and eliminating games from your player pool is a surefire way to draft a suboptimal portfolio of teams. We hammered this home in our Ultimate Best Ball Mania 5 guide video. But it's important to remember that we are betting on correlation, not weather. Last year's Browns-Jets Week 17 game was the perfect example. Thursday game on a short week, outdoors, El Nino year. Everyone was very concerned.
Dude, aren't you worried about a tornado in Cleveland on December 28th?
And then the game went nuclear. Breece Hall, Jerome Ford, and David Njoku all delivered week-winning performances. And the moral is, when a game goes off, the rising tide lifts a bunch of boats, regardless of predicted weather patterns. Look, I love all of the fantasy weathermen, just as much as I love all of our fantasy doctors and fantasy lawyers and fantasy psychologists. But we can barely predict if weather is going to impact a game hours before kickoff, much less 7 months out. We also can't predict injuries, which defenses are going to be decimated, what a game script is going to be. Remember when we all wanted to draft Derrick Henry last year because he famously played the Houston Texans in Week 17? And then he rushed 12 times for 42 yards as the Texans clobbered the Titans 26-3 because none of us predicted that the Texans offense was going to feature a dominant passing attack and game script Henry out of the game. We simply can't predict how these individual games are going to go. We don't have to though, that's the beauty, because what we can predict is the correlated benefits of a game shooting out. Ben Gretsch, my co-host on Ship Chasing, described this perfectly on a recent episode.
There is correlation between both offenses within games. And when we see games shoot out, like we talk about, like it's because that's how football works. The play volume will be correlated when one team starts, or efficiency, or like just scoring. Like if one team scores quickly, the other team's going to end up running more plays as they trail.
Yeah.
And a lot of times we see that in the second halves. We see it really shoot out in the fourth quarters. Like when I'm writing Stealing Signals during the year, like sometimes you'll get these fourth quarters where there's 21 points on both sides and it's the whole game. I mean, the other 3 quarters were not even as important as the fourth quarter. Like the other 3 combined were not as important as the fourth quarter. And those games rule. They fucking rule for fantasy football. Like that's what the game you want a piece of every time that happens.
And yet many drafters are once again missing the correlation forest for the weather trees. In the same way drafters outsmarted themselves by fading Browns-Jets last year, they are already lining up in parkas to fade Miami and Cleveland in Week 17 because they're worried about Tua's brain freezing over or something. These people will try to bury you underneath 8 feet of Tua's home road splits, not realizing that it has nothing to do with what we are trying to accomplish by correlating. Think of it like this. If you take Tyreek Hill in round 1, you have teleported to a new reality, a reality where Tua is immune to colder temps on the road, a world where he is going off in Week 17. By making that selection, you have already stepped into this alternate reality, and the rest of your picks need to exist within this same world. If Tyreek is winning you $1.5 million, then Tua is getting defrosted and slinging it around for 4 quarters. And if that happens, well, then the Browns pieces become intriguing characters who will also score lots of points within this $1 million snow globe you have constructed. Hopefully by this point, the concept of correlating indiscriminately across all of the Week 17 games makes sense. But it can still be difficult to know how to specifically quantify the value of correlation in your drafts. Easy from the Deposit Kingdom, who we featured in our Best Ball Mania guide after he advanced an absurd 55 of his 150 teams in BBM4, has built out a correlation spreadsheet that actually quantifies the value of these correlation boosts by looking at historical correlation data for teammates and bringbacks. Here's an example of what happens to pass catchers once you select a QB. In this example, it's Josh Allen. You can see the Bills pass catchers all get a big boost. 14% for Kincaid, 11% for the wide receivers, and you can also see that their Week 17 opponent, the Jets, also get a solid 6% boost as bringbacks. You can then see what these boosts do to a default rank, that's in the second column here, with a new adjusted rank, that's in the third column. This correlation boost makes each Bills pass catcher significantly more valuable to your Josh Allen squad than any other team in your draft, and thus makes them primary targets for the rest of this draft. By the way, if you do want to check out Easy's tool, I highly recommend it. It's available for purchase at ezdfs.xyz. But there's always a but. It's not that simple as drafting off an adjusted rank. Where correlation actually gets tricky is knowing how much should we go out of our way to secure this correlation. Should we be reaching for it? The point of Easy Sheet isn't to draft our stacks and bringbacks at their adjusted rank, because we'd then just be constantly reaching way ahead of ADP and losing value. For me, his tool demonstrates how our individual draft boards should be dynamically changing after each subsequent pick we make, but we still want to correlate at ADP as much as possible. This is because we know that reaching ahead of ADP for players, specifically in the early rounds, decreases our ability to advance out of the regular season into the playoffs. In Mike Leone's Best Ball Manifesto, the data showed that teams who snagged the most ADP value increased their advance rates by 50%. And inversely, the teams who had the worst ADP value, aka the people who reached the most, decreased theirs by a similar percentage. So that leaves us with 2 competing initiatives in drafts. Correlating gives our teams a positive boost, while reaching ahead of ADP gives them a negative dock. So anytime we draft a team, we are trying to balance these 2 dynamics. Think of it like a regular season angel on one shoulder telling us to get ADP value so we can get more teams to the playoffs, and a playoff devil on the other shoulder trying to get us to stack up Week 16 and 17 so we can win all the money. I'll work on those. Our main goal, though, should be to avoid canceling out our correlation benefits by reaching. If we can correlate at ADP, at value, then we can essentially free roll the playoff benefits of the game stacks. My preferred way to correlate is by correlating more as the draft progresses. So at the start, it's barely a consideration for me, but by the time I get to the final rounds, I'm aggressively making selections based on team level correlations or Week 16/17 bringbacks. Think of it like this. The players in the first few rounds of a draft are all studs. They're the equivalent of 8K plus salary players on a DraftKings DFS slate. They can score a ton of points in any game environment because of their skill and role on their offense. But as we progress through the draft, the players become less skilled with smaller roles. So them having a big game will require their team or game environment to exceed median expectation. Basically, they need the correlation to help them reach a ceiling more than the early round guys do. Because of this, I don't really seek out correlations in the first few rounds of my drafts. But the market sometimes disagrees, as they're already starting to place a premium on specific matchups over others. Detroit-San Francisco is a trendy game to stack up with a plethora of elite options to mix and match in the early rounds. And you can see here on Easy Sheet that when you select Amon-Ra St. Brown in round 1, there are small boosts to the Niners pass catchers in round 2. That 1.8% boost shifts them up each 3 spots in ADP. It's something, but it's not seismic. Everyone is on high alert this year to find our generation CeeDee Lamb, Amon-Ra St. Brown correlation, which was a fixture of BBM4 finals teams and a cornerstone to Freed's winning lineup. But one thing to remember is that CeeDee St. Brown was a chalk pairing because of the ADP. They were both going at the 1-2 turn, not because everyone was reaching to pair them together. The correlation was just a bonus and no value was lost when pairing them together. I think you can start to get yourself in trouble when you're making big reaches in the early rounds where the opportunity cost of reaching is far greater than in the late rounds. This is exactly what we talked about in our Scroll the F Down video. For example, I don't think reaching for Sam Laporta at the 2-3 turn to pair with CMC is necessarily egregious. You can see from Easy's sheet that the boost puts Laporta at a 2-3 turn value when you have CMC. But when you start to include other variables, you can see how this kind of drafting could get you into trouble. For this specific example, Laporta is already a somewhat fragile selection in that he's priced well ahead of the other elite tight ends, and he should arguably be going much closer to Kelsey, Andrews, McBride, etc. But the real issue in reaching for a CMC Laporta pairing is that you're often building a watered down version of the same pairing that more patient drafters will end up getting. There will be plenty of drafters this summer who get CMC at 103 or 104 in certain rooms, and then also get Laporta at ADP later in round 3, which means they will have your same pairing, but with a better second round pick. The other issue with constantly reaching for these early correlations is that even if it is a unique pairing right now, which is one of the selling points for reaching for it, there's no way to guarantee it will stay unique when we're drafting in May. There are still months to go in this contest. It could become a trendy reach, or ADPs could just shift on their own. It happens all the time. And then in that scenario, something you're reaching for now could go from a unique galaxy brain correlation to a chalk ADP pairing by August. Look, I'm pro getting unique combinations, especially for correlated reasons. But the time to do that is in the final month of drafting season when we know the combos we want more exposure to in our portfolio, as well as where the ADPs have settled. It might seem hard to juggle all of these considerations in a fast draft and that it'll be impossible not to reach to get your correlations, but I promise it's not. When you think of all the avenues you have for correlating, whether that's teammate stacking, week 17 bringbacks, or week 16 bringbacks, there's almost always a good correlation option at ADP value. You can also make this significantly easier on yourself by utilizing an overlay. I use Bric 75's Draft Caddy, which is a Chrome extension you can purchase at thedraftcaddy.com, and it allows you to overlay information in the draft queue like week 16 and week 17 opponents for every player, and it will also highlight players from your stacks as the draft progresses so you don't miss on any obvious correlations. Or you can go full analog like I'm doing for my Underdog Cardio Club drafts and print out a playoff correlation cheat sheet to have on hand when you're drafting on your phone. I'll upload this one right here that I've been using to the community tab on the Deposit Kingdom channel if you want to grab it, print it out yourself. Or you can use the mnemonic devices that Pat made at Legendary Upside. Those are also very handy. I will never forget that the Chargers play the Patriots because we have old Justin Herbert versus new Justin Herbert. Regardless, if you aren't drafting with the schedule in mind now, you are building suboptimally. I drafted my first BBM5 team post-NFL schedule with Pat Kerrane and Ben Gretsch on ship chasing the other day, and our picks reflect my ideal way to navigate a draft board while still correlating. Let's unpack this specific draft so you get an idea here. We drew the 1-3 and took Tyreek Hill because, yes, we're not scared of Tua freezing over. Jonathan Taylor then fell to us at pick 22, so we scooped up that ADP value. And then round 3 presented us with two really fun, solid ADP options at pick 27 that both had correlation boosts. We could either grab another Dolphins wide receiver in Jalen Waddle, or we could take a week 17 mini correlation with Taylor and the Colts in Malik Neighbors. We ended up going with Neighbors, but I think either pick would have been solid within this draft. In round 4, we wanted to take another wide receiver. We're worried about a wide receiver avalanche. We all slightly preferred Christian Kirk in a vacuum, but we broke a tie in favor of Amari Cooper because of his week 17 correlation with the Dolphins. He also had a higher ADP than Kirk, so this was the perfect time to get natural diversification and break ties in favor of the correlation. In rounds 5 through 9, we took best player available as we focused on structural objectives like an elite tight end and getting enough wide receiver firepower. And I think that's an important reminder to drive home. Drafting a well-structured team is still the most important thing in a draft. These correlations are secondary considerations. But when we hit round 10 in this draft, that's when we really put our correlation hats on. 8 of our remaining 9 picks were all driven by correlation. We took Tua to pair with Tyreek Hill. We took Justin Herbert to pair with our round 6 selection of Ladd McConkey. Then we selected Jalen Wright for another Miami piece. We took Quentin Johnston and Kamani Vidal for more Chargers pieces. We then took Jonnu Smith for another Dolphins pass catcher, Demario Douglas for a Week 17 bring back against our Chargers stack. Don't ever forget, new Herbert versus old Herbert. And then Deontay Foreman as another Cleveland bring back versus Miami. The Bucky Irving pick in round 15 was really the only pick of those 9 that wasn't entirely dictated by correlation. And here's the best part. Even with all of those picks being driven by correlation, not a single one of them was a big ADP reach. In fact, the biggest reach of any of those final picks was Jalen Wright, 2 picks ahead of ADP, which is nothing. So if there's one takeaway to drive home here, it's that you can build highly correlated teams without sacrificing a ton of ADP value. And if this sounds like fun, you're new to Underdog, they do have a new bonus offer for first-time depositors when you use promo code Pete. It's a 50% deposit match up to $250 in bonus cash. So if you deposit $500, you'll get an additional $250 in your account plus a special. Pick 'em, check that out with promo code Pete. All right, I can't make an NFL schedule video without indulging the Dome Bros a little bit, because what fun is it to dissect the schedule if there isn't a specific micro edge we can try to push here outside of correlating indiscriminately? The thesis behind the Dome Boner is pretty simple. Targeting games that are played in warm weather or dome games don't have any threat of weather impacting scoring. In a study done by Pinnacle on scoring in the NFL from 2003 to 2015, they found that total points per game scored in outdoor venues was almost 4 full points less, 42.4, than games played in a dome stadium, 46.2. There was also another study on covers.com that showed that games in domes also outpace overs by more than twice as much, 1.6 points on average, as outdoor games do, 0.7 points. We like dome games. We like warm weather games. And because of this, many Underdog drafters are already fully erect with their Dome Boners, specifically after watching Fareed's winning BBM4 team feature 2 game stacks that took place in a dome.
That was my most stacked game was Minnesota, Green Bay, and Dallas and Detroit were the main 2 games I tried to stack the most. So I was getting every piece I could from those 2 teams.
Matchup or the fact they were in domes, or what was the idea?
Fact they were in domes. I kind of am a dome bro, like a indoor game. Like at this part of the year, it always gets me, dude. Like the weather. Aren't you worried about the weather, bro?
And if there's one Week 17 dome game that has the chance to get extra pricey this year, it's likely the Ravens at Texans game. Not only is it easy to see that game projected as a shootout, but there are 9 players from this game who go in the first 5 rounds of drafts. But if I'm going to actually put a priority on domes and warm weather games, I want to do it across a larger sample than just a single game and give myself multiple chances at reaping that benefit. There's only one team who plays all 3 of their playoff games, weeks 15, 16, and 17 in a dome. That's the Las Vegas Raiders. They're home versus the Falcons, home versus the Jags, and then on the road versus the Saints in a dome. There are 2 other teams who play all 3 of their playoff games either in domes or in the sunny confines of Florida, the Jacksonville Jags and the Tampa Bay Bucks. The Jags are home versus the Jets in week 15, in the Vegas Dome in week 16, and home versus the Titans in week 17. And the Bucks play at the Chargers in Los Angeles, at the Cowboys in the Dome, and then home versus the Panthers in week 17. And considering none of those teams are particularly sexy or involved in premier week 17 matchups, I do like the idea of tilting some portfolio tiebreakers to these teams, knowing you can capture the benefits of 0 weather concerns across 3 weeks. One other Galaxy Brain correlation angle to entertain is round-robining a quartet of teams who play each other across multiple playoff weeks. This essentially allows you to buy 2 game stacks and get 1 free. The first one is what I like to call the Week 16-17 quad. It features the Texans, the Chiefs, the Steelers, and the Ravens. In Week 16, the Texans are at the Chiefs, the Steelers are at the Ravens, and then they mix and match. Week 17, the Chiefs are at the Steelers, and the Ravens are at the Texans. The other one I like is what I'll call the playoff quad. It features the Bears, the Packers, the Vikings, and the Seahawks. In Week 15, the Bears are at the Vikings, the Packers are at the Seahawks. In Week 16, the Vikings are at the Seahawks. Week 17, the Bears are at the Seahawks, and the Packers are at the Vikings. I'm not going to go crazy with targeting these, but it is fun to get some extra correlation boost with those pairings. The NFL schedule isn't all about gal-braining stacks and correlation though. It also provides us with the bye weeks. And I've rallied against bye week bros over the years. They're a unique breed, constantly living in fear, and yet it pains me to admit their condom-wrapped fear was largely warranted, because bye weeks, like ADP value, has a direct impact on our ability to advance teams out of the regular season. Neil Farley, who we featured in our Week 16-17 video, crunched the numbers on bye weeks last year, and his data proves that ignoring them is not advised. Consider these stats. Having two quarterbacks with the same bye week lowered your advance rate by 5%. Even having three QBs, two of them with the same bye week, lowered your advance rates by around 2%. At tight end, it's not quite as drastic, but there was still a negative impact. Drafting two tight ends with the same bye week lowered your advance rate by around 3%. Also, as you can see from both these QB and tight end charts, say no to drugs, say no to one QB and one tight end builds in BBM. The benefits you get with an extra running back or wide receiver are just not worth it. It's also worth mentioning, if you are doing hyper-fragile running back teams with only 3 to 4 running backs, try to avoid backs with the same bye weeks, as that also lowers your advance rate. When I say lower your advance rate, it's because the difference between third place and second place, which is the difference between not advancing and advancing, is often just a handful of points, which could essentially be a crappy tight end game. So if you're drafting a ton of teams like this, ignoring buys, you could easily not advance a few teams you otherwise would have, and we all should want as many playoff bullets as possible. My general rule of thumb is to always avoid bye weeks at quarterback and try to mostly avoid it at tight end. Looking at the 2024 schedule for bye weeks and tight ends, shout out to John Daigle from ETR, by the way, for putting these together. Tight end is fairly spread out. I guess one you could highlight, Dalton Kincaid and Kyle Pitts have the same bye week and should probably be avoided by the bully tight end bros. But otherwise, it's not too hard to avoid these bye week landmines at tight end. But there are some legitimate strategic considerations with the QB bye weeks. Week 14 looks rough. It's the final week before the playoffs, and 4 premium QBs are on bye: Anthony Richardson, Lamar Jackson, CJ Stroud, and Jaden Daniels. And so it's worth noting that if you're omega stacking Ravens Texans for Week 17, not only is that going to be very popular, but you're also going to have a ton of zeros in Week 14 with both of them on bye. Another interesting wrinkle to consider with the Week 14 buys are the 2 rookie quarterbacks, Drake May and Bo Nix. May specifically is already at risk of not starting the entire season, and we talked about this in our ADP Fallers video. And now on top of that, teams often like to use the bye week to transition to a new quarterback. So that late bye could potentially delay May hitting the field, which is something we should be considering when pulling the trigger on him late in drafts. I know. I guess I'm a bye week bro now. It's disgusting. I'm gonna go take a shower. Make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel for more videos here on the Deposit Kingdom.